Right. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. I'm setting my timer. This is an old joke that I use in sessions, but as somebody who talks about dating accuracy and precision, it's often useful to be on time in presentations. So when the buzzer goes, I will relinquish the stage. It's almost a promise, Alex. So it's lovely to be here. It's lovely to see so many old friends. As Alex said, I'm predominantly working in a university, but I do dating consultancy for interesting projects, and HS2 qualifies as an interesting project. What I'm going to be talking about is the ways that we use radiocarbon data and how we work with populations of radiocarbon data, because I was particularly struck by one of the speakers today saying that for big, large, exciting infrastructure projects, we should expect big, large and interesting research outcomes. There's a real beauty to the scale of these kinds of undertakings that we can leverage as a profession for our research outputs and also for understanding and informing and finessing our processes. And part of what I'm going to be talking about today is some academic work that I've been coordinating that I hope will have implications for professional practice and in transformative ways for the discipline of archaeology as a whole. It's a little bit galling to me that the session running at the same time as this is about professional, and I use that term deliberately, and academic integration. But there we go. So what I'm going to be talking about are two big structural problems with the way that we use large chronometric data sets in research projects and in big infrastructure projects. And I contend that there is something quite specifically different about chronometric scientific dating data sets in archaeology that has some big philosophical structural implications for the kinds of narratives that we do and the kind of research programs that we set up. That sounds a bit highfalutin. If you want to put it in a slightly simpler way, if you talk about the Iron Age, you are using a chronological model to talk about the past, and that has lots of implications. And I think, without getting a bit highfalutin as well, that's because radiocarbon data, chronometric data generally, are big data in archaeological terms, not because we have lots of them, we do have lots of them, but because the population of them as a whole is exhaustive in scope. It represents the whole sum total of our study period. So the human geographer Rob Kitchen classified big data, including these terms here. But what I'm interested in thinking about is the population of radiocarbon data and how those data and other chronometric data can tell us. Sorry, time check.
Right.
Okay. Interesting things about our study period. And with this in mind, I put together a couple of academic projects which received academic funding as a way to try and write more interesting narratives about the past. I'm going to be talking about one of them in a kind of brief way, and then another one in a bit more of an extended way. So the first one I'm talking about is Project Time, which is researching the 4th and 3rd millennium BC in Britain and Ireland. It's interesting, stuff happens. So far, so good. Radiocarbon dating is an expensive way of saying that stuff happens, but we're all here because we know that, hopefully. So how can we say more interesting stories about that beyond Iron Age people using spelt and Neolithic people building stuff? Because this comes back to the kind of ways that we talk about the past, the kind of narrative structures that we impose on the past, and their inability to cope with regional, local, and in this term, scheme-wide trends that we observe in the data. So that's the kind of background philosophical point. I'll return to it in a bit. What I'm really here to talk about is this project that I've been working on with colleagues in Britain and Ireland, with a number of national heritage agencies, including Historic England, Historic Environment Scotland, colleagues in Transport Infrastructure Ireland, the Irish Research Council, colleagues in the Department of Communities Northern Ireland, various stakeholders. And what this project was intended to do was work differently with how we curate and reproduce radiocarbon data, specifically in these terms. So it's a repository for putting data in. And in those terms, we can think about these in terms of fair data, making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But As I said, I contend that radiocarbon data play a special role in archaeological narratives. They are important because they are both the subject of our inquiries and they frame our discussions. So they sit in a dual location. You want to know how so old something is, but you also have a kind of background understanding of what happened. So they're really important data. But one of the problems that as a community archaeologists have had is that while we're quite good at working with spatial data, geophysical data, and archiving that data, we are, is this being recorded? Okay. Less good at working with chronometric data. And I'm not quite sure why that is, because the same data reuse problems with chronometric data that I encountered 20 years ago are still being put forward by experienced senior project managers working on unnamed projects, not this one, routinely. Why are we so consistently bad at this? And part of it is problems with reusing the data and archiving them, and the interpretation is a slightly different issue. So this project was designed to render radiocarbon data held by public organisations fair. And there are a number of particular problems for archaeologists with reusing these data. Some of the issues relate to the data quality and cleaning those data and repopulating important aspects of those data. And there are some interoperability issues, data standardization we've heard about before, but making data work across national heritage agencies is quite difficult. Using standardized period terms, for example, standardized feature types, controlled vocabularies established at a national level. We also need sustainable and scalable solutions. And this is unpopular because it has legacy beyond individual funded projects. And the way that I've tried to do this is by getting buy-in from our state heritage agencies to support this data repository as an ongoing resource beyond the project's end. So Historic Environment Scotland have changed their funding model to support the data set updates that are going to happen. Historic England have built a data entry form that you can put your radiocarbon data into, and they will periodically quality control and then upload those data. And we have alternative solutions in Wales and the island of Ireland. And then thirdly, we need investment from people who produce radiocarbon data and might want to use them, which runs across academia and the professional sector. So this is a little schematic of what I thought we might do as part of this project with the different stakeholders and how it works. As any big project manager will say, nothing works quite as simply as this. So more of that anon. But one of the biggest problems that we encountered as part of this project were the qualifiers that we need in radiocarbon data to make them reusable. So how much information about a radiocarbon measurement do you need to know to make it reusable and have longevity? So do you need context level descriptions? Do you need feature level descriptions? Do you need sample details? Do you need site classifications? How do you relate individual measurements? So preserving those extant data, simply scooping them off the web or from different stakeholders, as lots of these kinds of projects have done, is not enough. We actually need to transform and add value to these data. Now, before I lose you completely in this, small geeky moment aside, that was quite geeky, but this is geekier. Radiocarbon data are quite expensive to make. They're 300 quid a pop and a bit. But actually, when you cost the excavation, the post-ex, etc., they're really valuable. They have a huge amount of financial value. But when you think about them as a population of data, they leverage even more funding, because the more data that you have in those radiocarbon terms, and they should be interoperable because we're using time as a way of relating all of these data, we should have an even better understanding of patterns and change in the past. So these data actually increase in value the more that we have of them. That might be analogous to ADNA and other types of scientific analysis. But the common factor of having that time dimension across all of this data and these data sets makes radiocarbon data and chronometric data particularly important. Now, I said that no project runs as smoothly as you would like. And this project, with our bunch of stakeholders from various historic environment agencies across various national jurisdictions, encountered a whole bunch of questions about exactly which data we were going to curate and whose definition of features we were going to use, etc., etc. However, we've got to the end of it. It's going to launch this month, I'm reliably told. I was reliably told we'd be beta testing last month, and we haven't done that. So let's just rock with this. So this is our kind of repository model. It's hosted by the ADS. One more point on interoperability. Because we're doing an international project, one of the key things that we're interested in is period classifications, and colleagues mentioned that with regard to specific schemes. But obviously we don't have the same period classifications in different parts, in different nations. So one of the things that we've done is made this repository return to you common period terms when you enter the relevant your local national term. So if you're working in Scotland and you search on Pictish and you want to find out what happened in the Romano-British period in other parts of the UK, you get the same suite of measurement, the relevant suite of measurements back. What we've also done is that you can search on time periods when the calibrated dates come through. So if actually what you want to know is what was going on in the 5th century AD in Northern Ireland and Wales, you can return those results. Now, talking about scalar effects of big projects and data sets, one of the things that we can do with this is use the data set as a form of analysis. So results-wise, we're about to launch. We've got about 30,000 measurements cleaned and transformed from across our different jurisdictions. We've got buy-in from our government agencies to support this beyond the project end and to help curation, which I think is actually the major take-home rather than the number of data in this. And then we can do some analysis on the results. So these are results by different jurisdictions over time, so time's the axis along the bottom. I am not actually interested in these results. I've got a couple of trends that I'll point out to you, but this is not the take-home for me. This is about enabling research. I think one of the legacies of scientific data, because they are kind of science facts and they validate your assertions and your observations and you can use them to prove your narrative, is that people have had a kind of hoarding mentality of keeping my data close, like Smaug sitting on top of your golden data coins. I'm not interested in that in any way, shape or form. I think it's far more interesting to facilitate research and allow people to access your data sets. We are more than the sum of our parts, and only collaborating can we kind of draw those wider, more interesting, more nuanced narratives about our common human history. So a couple of take-homes here. Wales has in the dark on the sort of Paleolithic type radiocarbon results on there, disproportionate interest in dating Paleolithic sites. That's because I think the research history of a particular person working in the National Museum in Wales, that's quite interesting, but you know. In the Republic of Ireland, which is the lighter blue one, in 500 to 1000 AD, we see this huge spike in radiocarbon measurements. And I think we could tie that into a narrative of national identity in the Republic of Ireland and what archaeologists working in there are interested in producing radiocarbon measurements on. So we can tell you, you can look at this and pick out trends in the number of data that are produced in different time periods, which might be quite interesting if you want to compare the Bronze Age to the Roman period in your particular part of the world. But actually the kind of environment in which this population of data are being produced may be as interesting in and of itself. So I'd rather think about those trends than proving that there were more people using spelt wheat and cows in the Cotswolds than there were in Wiltshire or other southern English places exist. Anyway, so the other project that I briefly introduced, and I've only got 35 seconds, so I might stop my timer because otherwise...
You can have a few minutes more. We have a bit of extra time this afternoon. So.
The audience might not think that. I've got 4 slides left, so I'll try and not overstay my welcome. So the other project that I mentioned was this Project Time, which is about the 4th and 3rd millennium, what happened in those time periods. And the reason why these two projects together address structural issues with the way that we create narratives and talk about data in the past is that if you are Smaug and keep your data close to you, you aren't really engaging with narratives. But also, if you think that there is a thing called the Iron Age and you go out and look to find the Iron Age, you probably will find it within your terms of inquiry, but that can be quite limiting. And to my mind, rather than talking about your local culture, historic terminology, whatever it happens to be, and identifying particular patterns in the archaeological record, we happen to see lots of single fill pits in the 38th century Cal BC, and we think the Neolithic starts around then, so we see lots of pits, so the Neolithic starts then, blah, blah, blah. That kind of self-reinforcing narrative structure. Actually, it's more interesting when you work with big data sets, and this is what I'm trying to do in Project Time, when you look at time and variability in practices across those culture historic terms. So this is a particular part of southeast Scotland. I was thinking about Headland, and radiocarbon data in distributions for different types of practices. So in blue, we have beaker deposition. In red, we have cremation deposition. In green, we have inhumations. In magenta, we have grooveware. And in orangey, yellow, gold thing, we have metal distributions. And you can see the peaks and troughs and waves in these different types of activity over a scale of 2 centuries along the bottom. Now, if I was applying a conventional kind of culture historic narrative to this, I'd say that's the start of the Bronze Age in 2500. That's the really interesting thing. But for me, looking at these data packages and thinking about practices, it's actually more interesting that, and this is where I might go a bit weather person. No, hang on. Have I got a mouse? No, curses. Right, we get that flux at 24100, where we get grooved ware going down and beaker pottery being deposited at the same time. These inflections in practices and activity. At 21600, we get that nexus between inhumation rising up there, cremation lagging a bit behind it, but still coming up as well, and a slightly flatter distribution representing beaker distribution. So these fluxes and changes and variability in the human record, in human practices, are for me far more interesting than pushing our narratives into preformed structural approaches. Last 2 slides, honestly. Right, so in this talk I focused on one particular aspect of the structural problems with how we talk about time in terms of radiocarbon data curation. I think we also have to be better about incorporating members of the public with our narratives. Sorry, I'm a bit nervous and that was the wrong word. Inviting members of the public into our narratives. So if you're on Anglesey in the summer, we're doing this open day on one of the sites that I work with CADU colleagues. And I also think we need to be a little bit more considered about how we use radiocarbon data in our narratives. So finer-grained chronologies can give us a better understanding of past practices, but they can only do that if we think critically about the structural narratives that we try and fit things into. So we have to think smarter and work harder to generate new and innovative narratives. And during HS2, I hope that we'll be able to try and apply both the temporal time pattern approach and better data standards to come up with these kinds of narratives. I've written some stuff. It's all open access because it should be ethically. If you'd like to read it, take a look. Thank you very much.